thing that's legitimate about that argument would be the argument that it proves we no longer need conscription, so there's no reason to not abolish it.
I mean, because if we're not using it, then why do we need it?
Exactly. Okay, so fine, let's eliminate conscription. It cannot be done anymore. There is no longer allowed to be a selective service. It is an obsolete government imposition on the public, right?
Well,
Start arguing that.
And it's actually even more dishonest when you think about it, because the military, because there has actually been recent discussions as a libertarian who's very close to the politicians in the Republican and Democrat parties. I can't remember his name, but he's very knowledgeable on this, and he pointed out that there is talks about using conscription because the number of people in the military in the United States has gone dramatically down.
Yeah,
And
that's because the politicians have made being in the army unattractive.
Yeah, and I'm saying, so it's unrealistic, to say that it's impossible for them to find a justification for using it is BS.
But it doesn't matter if it's being argued that conscription isn't a problem because it's no longer used, then that argument justifies arguing that conscription should be eliminated because it's no longer used. It's like there's no chance, right? No chance. So why should we even have conscription?
Well,
it puts the person on their back foot, and the only thing that they can do is concede to that argument that conscription of just men places an undue burden on men for no valid reason, because now they're just saying you have to sign up for this without any reason for you to have to sign up for it, and therefore should be eliminated. And so it still represents discrimination against men, and they should be pushing to eliminate conscription altogether. But instead, they just want to argue that it's not discrimination.
Well, I mean, basically their argument really, because here's the thing, the logical thing you would get is like what you said. I mean, discrimination at very best is pointless. I mean, not discrimination. Conscription at very best is pointless. At worst, it's destructive.
Right. And it's pointless discrimination that does have an immediate and present impact on the lives of the men who are being discriminated against. Yeah, they have to sign up for this system or they don't get their college money. They can be considered felons. There's a whole bunch of other things they're not eligible for. And women don't face the same standard.
Yeah, but I mean, another thing is like, here's the third thing that I've given them this possibility that could happen, because women make up the what's a worse thing is the fact that women make up a majority of voters as well.
Right.
So I said, hypothetically, you could, in theory, have a politician that's a complete war hawk who makes it completely clear that he is going, once he gets into office, he's going to use conscription to fight, let's say, a war in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. Hypothetically, he could get very low men's support. But if he gets just enough women's support, he becomes president and he enacts conscription, and only men that mostly didn't vote for him, get sent to the meat grinder.
Yeah, that's true. You could. And then actually in the UK, the reason that the voting rights were expanded to commoners because they were not at that, like the Voting Rights Act that expanded voting rights to include women also expanded voting rights to include people at income levels and lack of property ownership that previously those details excluded them from the vote in the UK. They did not have even universal male suffrage.
Well, yeah, I mean, another people
don't. And the reason given for that expansion was specifically because young men who were of lower income or came from lower income households had been conscripted, sent to war in World War I, and then told when they returned, still, lower property ownership and still under certain ages that they could not vote, right?
Mhm. I
So the
mean,
voting rights were expanded to them because of that.
and this is
And women just kind of got tagged in there
Mhm.
um, without having really earned it.
Yeah, and well, here's the thing that I will, and that's also what gets me mad because, and it shows you that feminism was a rotten movement to begin with, because the suffragettes were basically the ones arguing that they were uniquely oppressed for not getting the voting rights, while there was men who didn't have the voting rights who were actively fighting a war.
Right. And the other thing the suffragettes did was, do you know about the white feather movement?
Oh yeah, and
And the suffragettes were a big part of the white feather movement.
and I mean,
So
well, funny thing is like, well, people often don't. People will stop there on the war and stuff like that with the white feather movement. People don't know how actually far back that goes.
yeah,
You know how far back it goes, as far as I know of? It goes all the way back to the first Crusades,
yep. And
where
and it's the
where
same thing every time. Women walking up to men, handing them a white feather as a sign of their cowardice for refusing to go fight a rich man's war that
yeah,
doesn't benefit them in any way.
yeah, and I mean, what's funny, and like that's always been the case because here's the thing: you can get any man to fight any war, even wars that he completely disagrees with, if you just simply tell him one thing. If you don't fight this war, the enemy will kill your children and your wife.
Yep,
If you tell any man that, he will do anything.
that is true. And unfortunately, our government has figured out that they can lie through their teeth to the degree that their lie is actually fairly transparent, and people will still panic over that they're coming for your women uh, argument, and
I,
and they'll support a war that they should not support.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's sort of like this. This happened all over. I mean, this always goes back in American history as well because, like, like a common argument that people will make is, well, why would Southerners fight to preserve slavery if they're if they were poor and they didn't have slaves themselves? I've said, well, you forget the context, what the men were told.
Yep, they were told they're coming for your women.
Yeah, they said. Well, they said if the North succeeds in freeing the slaves, the first thing the freed slaves are going to do is rape and kill your women and children.
Yep,
And
Allison actually did a whole talk on that.
yeah, so I mean, so basically, it's the same strategy. You tell men a lie that these people. What I mean, a true. It could be true or false, but a lot of times it's false. That your enemy is going to kill your family. And a man will, no matter, even if he hated slavery or he hated the war to begin with, he will fight the war.
Yeah, well, the other thing is there was a draft,
Yeah.
and there were penalties against Southerners who refused to fight. So it wasn't all an all volunteer army.
Well, yeah,
Um,
that's the
so
same.
yeah, that they didn't just in a vacuum get up and decide, oh, we're gonna fight for slavery. That wasn't how that worked.
Well, I mean, well, just think about it this way. I mean, like I said, the amendment to the Constitution doesn't actually abolish slavery. It just makes the government more or less the monopoly on it
Yeah,
because now they have a monopoly through the prison system and through conscription.
yeah,
So I mean, the real thing is, it's like they didn't abolish. They abolished public slavery for the most part. They just didn't abolish. I mean, well, they abolished private slavery. I mean,
yeah,
abolished public slavery, which,
yeah.
in my,
They abolished slavery as a private enterprise.
but not as a public one, which in my opinion is even worse.
Oh yeah,
Because, because here's the difference between a governor who has a slave and a private owner that has a slave. A private owner can at least care about his slaves' well-being to the degree that, if he kills the slave, he'll lose a lot of money.
yeah.
So he can completely, for selfish reasons, care about the slave's well-being.
A
But
um a private owner can also be, at least to a degree, regulated by his community.
yeah, but
The government ends up a totalitarian government like we're seeing now, with its own prison slave system. It is much harder for any community to hold that government accountable for its treatment of any group of people.
yeah, and
And
and here's what I've always said is about that is that what happens is with it is that through the conscription and the the slavery, I mean the whole situation really comes down to it, like where it still exists, but not on a mostly not on a private level. It exists on a public level, which is worse because the difference is that a slave owner can be at least selfishly beneficial to the slave, whereas the government, they'll never take a loss.
right.
Because let's think about it, they could kill as many slaves as they want, and what they'll just simply do is tax the taxpayers to regroup the money.
Yeah, that is true. And there are circumstances that you can say that, the government is killing them. They're working them to death. They're creating an environment in which they're going to kill each other. And the other thing that people don't maybe consider, the target population is the same target population from before. So it could be considered a form of genocide as well.
Yeah,
But
funny, like I've said, well, if our nation is racist, it's very selectively racist.
yeah,
Be-
it
be-
is.
well, think about it like this, because let's think about it this way. I made this statistic. This is a true statistic, but it's and also an analogy. Statistically speaking, if a white man were to drive a car with his black girlfriend and a police stopped him, it would be far more likely that the cop would shoot the white man than his black girlfriend,
Right.
and or put him in prison. So apparently our racist system, prefers black women over white men.
Right. In terms of the police shootings, though, the thing that statistically makes you most likely to get shot in a situation is if you have a physical confrontation with the police over your arrest. When you actually go back and look at police shootings that take place during an arrest, they're not pulling people out of their cars, throwing them on the ground and shooting them, or approaching people in a public place and just shooting them without cause, without any interaction or anything. Um, in almost all of the cases, like once in a blue moon, something very strange happens where a cop has actually shot somebody who was not doing anything and did not fail to comply.
Yeah,
Like there, but for the most part, the overwhelming majority of those circumstances where people in a conflict with the police have gotten shot, it is because the police are responding to either a panicked or an oppositional uh, uh, defensive response when they attempt to arrest or confront the individual. And there are a few instances where a failure to comply is alleged where the opportunity to comply was not given.
yeah,
And one of those, it has absolutely nothing to do with race. It's disability.
yeah,
And that is where the accused, or the suspect that is being confronted by the police, physically cannot hear the instructions the police are shouting at him, and is confused by the situation and doesn't comply because they don't know what the instruction is. And so there are hearing impaired people who have been confronted and shot by police because police shouted instructions at them and didn't figure out from the manner of their response that they were dealing with a deaf suspect who couldn't hear the instructions. And then my brother had a friend who, this guy was just kind of a redneck. And he was socially awkward enough that as a redneck that he didn't move forward in time with the rest of society in terms of what is acceptable behavior with a gun in public.
Uh,
So he had I want to say it was a pistol, but it was a handgun. It was not a rifle. It was not semi-automatic or automatic or anything like that. Just a little handgun that he had a friend that he had talked to about the gun. He wanted to show it off, just take it over and say, "Look, here's the gun they got," and they could look at it and talk about it together and everything. He was driving his Jeep over there. It was summertime. He was shirtless, and the Jeep broke down. We didn't want to leave this gun in his Jeep. It wasn't covered. He couldn't lock his gun in the Jeep. There wasn't anything to lock. And so he put the gun down the back of his pants, took the ammo out, and so it wouldn't go off, and just stored it there. And started walking to his friend's house where he figured, he'd call for a tow and a ride home, and that would be it. Well, some woman looked out her door and saw a guy walking down the street with a gun tucked down the back of his pants and panicked. But she couldn't just justify calling the cops. That's open carry. It's not concealed. You can see it. So she couldn't just call the cops and say there's a guy open carrying down the street from my house because that's not illegal. He's not actually doing anything even suspicious, right? He's out in the open with it. Everybody knows he has it. He's not hiding anything. So what she did was she accused him of pointing it at traffic and waving it around and acting drunk and stupid and stuff. And no other witnesses came forward to say that that was happening, and one guy contradicted her story. But the officer who showed up in response to the call had believed her, and the officer was one who should not have been on that call. He actually was supposed to be when an officer is involved in a shooting where he has to fire his weapon, even if the other person that he fired at doesn't die or get injured or anything, like he fires a warning shot and it hits a wall or something, um, he still has to go through a process and he is off the beat for a period of time after that. Well, this particular officer, there was an injury or death involved in his shooting. So, in addition to going through a process and being off the beat during that time, he had a psych eval he was supposed to go through, and he hadn't gone through that. And he was not supposed to be in uniform. He was not supposed to be on the clock. None of that. But he responded because they were shorthanded. They had brought him back to do desk work or something. And there wasn't anybody else to respond to the call. He went out there. And according to witnesses, what he did was he shouted at the young man to drop the gun, and the gun was not in the young man's hands. So he shouted at him to drop the gun. The young man had his hands up, and this confused the kid because he didn't have a gun in his hands, and you can't just drop what's sitting in the back of your pants. And the young man said something along the lines of not understanding what the cop wanted him to do, and he shot him and killed him instantly. And that was a white kid, not a black kid. White cop, white kid, mostly white community. Um, and that shooting did not get widely reported. There was no outrage over it, national outrage over it. Al Sharpton didn't show up in that community and protest the police killing of a citizen. There was no, Black Lives Matter protest, none of that because it was a white kid.
yeah, and well, I mean, here's what's funny: like people will point out a lot to the black community's distrust for police officers, and I point out this fact too. If you want to know people that really, really hate the police in large numbers, talk to
Mm-hmm.
X.
Oh yeah, yeah. That is definitely true.
Well,
You
here's
look
a
up the what are they called? Sovereign citizens on YouTube that make videos about how to confront police officers, how to stand up for your rights and stuff like that. A lot of them are not big fans of the cops.
Yeah, and I mean, but here's the thing, personally, I am a redneck myself, and I will say one incident that I had with a cop. It was a nice cop. He knew me because I always went around the store that he patrolled,
Mm-hmm.
and what happened was is that he had one day pulled me over, and he had said, I got a report that a guy that looked like had robbed a store. The guy was wearing like a sort of jacket that I was wearing at the time.
Yeah.
And, I said, look, you can ask me all the questions you want. I didn't do anything.
Right.
I mean, I said, I want to tell him this. I had a joke inside my head because that's just how I am. I said, if the guy looks like me, you should just let him off with a warning. He's already suffering enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would make that kind of joke too.
Yeah. I mean, so that was the joke that was going through my head. Because whenever I'm in a stressful situation, that's sort of what I do.
Yeah, me too.
And what happened was like this was a nice cop, genuinely nice guy, but but he's a cop. He has to do his job. So he pulled me over, and he asked me a couple questions, and I said I'm just walking like because I was walking to the store, and he said that a guy robbed the store, and I want to say, well, if I robbed the store, why would I be walking back there?
Yeah.
But I mean, I didn't say that because I didn't want to start a fight or anything. But you know, and what happened. I remember this is like because I went to give him my phone that was in my pocket. In order to say, look, this is where I've been at. I have the text messages from my sister.
Yeah.
And what happened is the minute I put my hand in my pocket, he said, "Take your hand out of your pocket."
Yeah, because he doesn't know that you're not reaching for a gun to shoot him.
Yeah,
That's
which
one of the things that I explained to my son when he started taking driver's ed is if you ever get pulled over by the cops, there are some things you need to know to do because of how many people shoot at them. The first one is no matter how small of an action it is, you never do anything without telling the officer what you're about to do. If he asks you for your license and registration, you tell him, I have to open the glove compartment to get those. And so he knows that you're getting into your glove compartment for a reason and not just reaching, because he has to operate under the assumption that if he doesn't know you and you reach into your glove compartment, you might be planning to shoot him.
yeah, which I mean, I got the reason why I think he was very light on me because, like I said, I consistently go to the store that he patrols.
Yeah. So he knew you and he knew you probably weren't the guy, but he
But
still had to question you because it was his responsibility as a police officer to do that.
yeah,
And
and
he still, even if he knew you, he didn't probably know you well enough to be 100% certain that you didn't do anything and you were not going to shoot at him.
yeah, I know that. Well, I mean, even a
So,
person
like,
that
that's basically the situation.
yeah, I know, but even a person that you believe can't possibly do anything wrong, they could
Right.
crazy moment.
Right. And I've seen that happen actually in real life. Um, somebody that was one of my best friends that I trusted completely uh, put me through one of the most traumatic experiences of my life over and over again because there was a level of cognitive dissonance that I had happening and a level of gaslighting that she engaged in that it actually made it very difficult for me to process and evaluate and respond to the situation for about a year until I finally put my foot down,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah,
But
and
yeah, like the person who behaves normally all the time can have something within themselves that they are hiding
mhm.
that comes out in the worst possible moment. That's an extreme version, but there are times where you think somebody's not an asshole in any way, shape, or form, and then you find out that under certain circumstances they have a mean streak, and it might be related to a prejudice or a you know a mental hang up or whatever. But
You know,
prejudice is basically all prejudices are mental hang ups.
yeah.
So
But I mean, my point of my story was also look because I'm both autistic and I'm a redneck,
yeah,
and you know, there was no part of me in that interaction with the cop that ever led me to believe, oh, that this cop could not shoot me.
yeah.
It's not like I said, oh, well, I'm not black. This cop will just let me off easy. I,
No,
oh,
that's one of those things that's a myth.
yeah. I said because I'm a redneck and I personally know plenty of white people that absolutely hate the cops and talk about being shot at by them.
Well, not to mention the fact that actually being a redneck can make you more likely instead of less likely to be a target for arrest. I think a lot of people don't realize this, but there's a lot of white people who are not country folk or redneck, rural. A lot of urban white people are very prejudiced against urban or non-urban white people. Um, where they have this level of contempt that is quite palpable. You could almost reach out and touch it.
Well, I mean,
And
also the point was is like like I said, is like I'm autistic and I'm white, but the thing is also say, well, I'm autistic, so I'm afraid that I'm not good with social interactions.
right,
I'm
but it
worried about,
is it
and so
isn't
so I'm worried about like I'm not going to know how to do the right
right.
thing. That won't get me shot.
It is entirely possible also to run into a cop that would view you in the worst possible light because you are, a rural person with a somewhat southern accent, and like the phrase white trash was not invented by black people, right? That was invented by urban whites who are prejudiced against rural whites, and in particular rural whites that live a lifestyle that is independent of amenities that urban people come to rely on.
What's funny
And
about what's funny about that nowadays is that the rednecks that I know now, it's sort of like white trash is like the N word for them. That they sort like they are offended when anyone calls them that, but
right.
they're telling people that they are white trash.
Well, and it's intended as a substitute for the N word, and it actually relies on the N word to legitimize it. So it's a when you hear somebody get called white trash, the person calling them that is admitting to two bigotries: that they are prejudiced against people who are not white, and that they are prejudiced against white people who are neither rich nor urban.
Yeah, I mean, what people don't fail to realize about here's the thing about white supremacy. It's not just the obvious that they will hate black people. That's obvious.
Right.
They'll also eat like the white slave owners. Like it's not just the obvious that they'll hate black people. That's obvious. That goes without saying. But they also hate poor white people just as much, if not more,
Yep, very much so.
because they
And it comes out in all kinds of interesting ways. And
to them they say, "Well, look, I view my race as supreme, and these white trash people are making the race look bad."
right. And it some of the strange things that you see as means of expressing that the behavior is so completely irrational. Like just not wanting to do business with somebody because they have a southern accent, or believing a statement of fact to be false because it's stated with a southern accent. If you say the sky is blue, um, versus the sky's blue, it's you get a totally different reaction from the urban person. They suddenly start looking up to see if it still is or not.
Well,
And
those
it's not necessarily all city people are like that. It's just a particular breed, I guess you could say, of city people that act like that.
You heard of Ebonics, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what people like, people don't like to understand like that. Like, I know many black people that don't actually know the history of Ebonics. Basically,
You mean the
Ebonics.
fact that it's made up?
Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, all language is made up.
No, no, I mean the category is made up.
Oh yeah, but I mean, like I know, but the Ebonics, quote unquote Ebonics,
Yeah.
how it developed was slave owners obviously weren't interested in teaching their slaves English, proper English, and they had a Southern accent. And basically, the black people could only go off the word of mouth of their slave owners who had a Southern accent, and so obviously since they weren't educated because they couldn't be because many laws prohibited that,
Yeah.
they sort of had to they spoke broken, even more broken English than Southern English.
There was one more factor contributing to that. You also have to remember that in the pre-civil rights environment, um, people who were white and bigoted, and even some people who were black and bigoted, would abuse black people for sounding intelligent. If they sounded too intelligent, they were accused of being uppity,
Yeah. So,
and that did contribute. And what really is sad about it today is while that was enforced, like you had to pretend to not know better if you were black under Jim Crow and prior, in order to avoid being abused for sounding quote uppity, which basically it was just a way of keeping people down illegitimately, right? Now
and
today, you will find black people who will castigate other black people for sounding too white.
yeah.
And the critical race theory admonition that terms describing personal accountability that leads to success, economic success, and social success, and stuff like that, that those are white things and that black people should avoid them. That's an attack on black success
Mhm.
in the name of eliminating prejudice against black people.
Which is stupid.
Right. And it's going to end up damaging our entire society.
Well,
And the people that are going to suffer the most from it are black people who buy into this idea that if they take actions on their own behalf to promote their own economic and social success, that they are somehow acting not black. If they take that seriously and they live by that, it's going to trap them in a cycle of poverty and social, not being ostracized, but being at odds with their community, which is a horrible thing to do to a group of people. And it's actually being done in the name of saving them from racism. But it's one of the most racist things I've ever heard of.
yeah, and the thing that people really don't get, like, there's a side that they don't tell you about, a like even if you hypothetically were a white supremacist, you shouldn't support a white supremacy government because here's the thing that they don't really tell you. Whenever you have the government assign any class of people based on a malleable metric as superior or inferior, what you're ultimately going to end up with is including people that you never wanted to be included and excluding people that you actually wanted to be included.
Well, there is another thing, right? Anytime
Yeah.
a civilization deems a class of people superior to all other classes of people, that superior class that, supposedly superior in scare quotes, but that class of people that's deemed to be superior becomes responsible for everybody else because if they're inferior, they're not as capable of being responsible for themselves as the supposed superior class. Now, when you have that situation, there's two ways that can go. One of them is a feudalistic system wherein the group of people who deems themselves superior and responsible for all of the other people also have power over the other people. And that would be like if you see the progressive left and the progressive right that have deemed themselves smarter than everybody else and responsible for everybody else, they have the power to force everybody to obey them. They're in an advantageous position. But in the situation of an entire ethnic group, for instance, let's say our society came along and actually deemed an entire ethnic group superior to all other ethnic groups and therefore responsible for them. And let's say we took the group that is statistically better at math, right? Let's say we say the stereotypical statistically better at math group is Asians. So we say Asian Americans are superior to all other Americans. Therefore, Asian Americans bear responsibility for the welfare of all other Americans. All
Mhm.
right. Now we have just justified our government, which is in power, imposing obligations on Asian Americans to accommodate entitlements of other Americans who are inferior and need somebody to be responsible for them. And our government is an advocate on our behalf. But
Yeah.
we're not doing that with Asian Americans, right? We're doing that with white people. And
Well,
so we don't have the protection that Asian Americans have, where if you said, well, we're gonna make Asian Americans pay everybody reparations for the egregious differences that take place in math class, everybody would recognize that's racist, that's discrimination, and that is actually, since they have to labor to obtain those wages, as a minor form of slavery. You can't do that. But since it's white people and there is no historical context of saying any other group oppressed white people in history that people today think of and remember,
well,
then we don't have that protection, and people are accepting it without thinking about it.
I mean, what's funny is what they like. What I was telling you about how you'll always end up including groups into the superior group that you never wanted to include in the beginning, and excluding
Mm-hmm.
people that you actually wanted to include. I mean, you can see that bear out in history because whenever you look at any white supremacy policy, it always ends up hurting poor white people.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing, for example, slavery. Basically, it makes it so it's impossible to find a job as a poor white person because why is an owner going to hire you if they can get a slave?
Good point. Um,
And this way also, Jim Crow laws. Well, guess who benefited most from Jim Crow laws? Rich companies,
yeah.
because they can afford to be discriminatory because they can eat that cost, but poor white companies that who they might or may not be racist themselves, but who would still take black money because they like money,
All
but
right. Well, I
they're
mean, a chain fast food place would be able to afford to discriminate against a group of people and say that because of your immutable characteristics, you cannot sit in this part of the restaurant. And if you don't like it, you don't have to come in here and eat. Or you can't eat at this restaurant. This restaurant is people without your immutable characteristic only, right? They
yeah.
could afford to do that because they are international. They get business all over the world, and they would be able to target areas without people with that immutable characteristic, whether it was black, white, having buck teeth, blue eyes, freckles, being 6 feet tall, whatever. If you're 6 feet or over, you can't come into this restaurant, wouldn't bankrupt any company that is big and international like that. But a mom and pop diner is limited in its customer base to the people within its community and anybody within the surrounding community that likes their food so much they will travel there to eat. But they're not necessarily going to be getting people coming from halfway across the country to eat there, and they don't have a location halfway across the country to capitalize on that population. So if they come along and say this segment of our community cannot come in and eat here, They have just limited themselves to the degree that they're cutting out a big segment of their population or their customer base.
Well, like I was saying, is like, so like I was saying, like slavery basically made it illegal. I mean, it didn't make it illegal, but it made it almost nearly impossible for poor white people to get jobs.
Right,
Jim Crow laws basically penalized poor white businesses, and
right.
the voting laws, that the voter literacy laws, while they were intended to target black people, they also had the effect where they discriminated against poor white people who couldn't afford the education either.
Oh, actually, they targeted poor white people. Don't kid yourself. The way that the voting discrimination happened was actually quite convoluted.
Yeah,
It wasn't just that there was a poll tax. It was, if I don't want you to vote, maybe the person ahead of you, their poll tax is 2 cents. But if I don't want you to vote, your poll tax is $500, right? And then the other one is, all right, the literacy test for the person in front of you is what color is that red truck down the street? But the literacy test for the person I don't want to vote is, please spell anti-disestablishmentarianism backwards in 30 seconds,
yeah,
right? So that's um it targeted black people primarily. It
yeah.
also targeted other minorities. It targeted lower income people that the elite in the South did not want to vote. And of course, it targeted anybody who had moved their residence, because you had carpetbaggers and stuff that moved south to take advantage of the economic downturn and such. Now, it doesn't change the situation. Like, what it did to black people was egregious, and what
Well,
it did to everybody else was egregious. It's even worse by the fact that it targeted a wider scope and larger number of people.
than we
But
thought.
even if it hadn't, it would have been a terrible thing just on the basis of the prejudice behind it when it
Yeah,
attacked black people.
yeah. And I mean, the thing is, like I always like to point out, is like, so I would say, if you were a poor white supremacist, person in the South, it would be in your best of interest to not have a white supremacist government.
Right.
So it's in fact, the argument could be, is like, you don't even have to make the non-rate the racism is bad argument. You could say, hell, if you're a racist, you still shouldn't want this.
Right. Well, and then when it comes to racism and issues like that, there's other things that arguments people have made that I think are kind of stupid.
Yeah.
One of them is, in order to combat racism, we should limit what people say. My answer to that is, how do you know who the racists are if everybody speaks the same way and you don't learn what people are really thinking?
Well, that, and also, what also it does is, like, it doesn't actually prohibit them from saying it, is they just take it underground.
Right? They do take it underground, and the other, but
You
and
know,
in addition to them taking it underground, that means you are denied the ability, the opportunity to use your right to freedom of association to say, if that's your attitude, fuck you, I don't want to do business with you, I don't want anything to do with you, leave me alone. I'm going to hang out with these other people. I'm going to do business with these other people. You're a piece of shit racist, right? You won't be able to do that because you won't find out. You
yeah,
don't know they're a racist if they can't express it, if they don't demonstrate it. And of course, if there is no expression of it and people are trying to figure out who the racists are based on things like so-called microaggressions and shit like that, then you end up in a situation where somebody whose intentions are perfectly good, who is not prejudiced against anybody, but who maybe looks like they've made a misstep, because you have to evaluate, instead of asking them questions, you have to evaluate their behavior through a filter of stereotypes and stuff. get accused of racism and treated like they have done something to somebody when they haven't, and it takes away their from their experiences, might damage them economically, might damage them socially, and so on. And then
Yeah,
also anybody who could benefit from associating with them, whether it's economically or socially or whatever, might lose out because they are socially compelled to avoid that association based on the presumption that this person is racist. And it damages all kinds of, like, there's all kinds of problems with not being able to express bad ideas. The bad ideas never get debated. The people who have bad ideas are not identified. You don't get the opportunity to avoid them. Bad people who don't have bad ideas might get confused with or falsely accused of having bad ideas, and associations that should happen might get destroyed. And then on top of everything else, there are some ideas that we deem bad that are actually things that need to be explored because they highlight problems that could be fixed. For instance, when people talk about black crime rates, right? And we have a thing that happens with the men's rights movement where feminists will bring up male crime rates, right? Men commit most of the crimes, and therefore men are violent and bad, and women are innocent and perfect, and blah blah blah, right? And I've seen racists do the same thing with black crime rates, and people knee jerk react to this with this idea that we can't talk about black crime rates. But the truth is, if there is a higher rate of criminal conviction per capita among black people than there is among white people, that is something that should be evaluated, because the likelihood is that's not a genetic thing. It's probably an environmental thing. And we should look at what kind of environmental factors are contributing to that, and whether our society's laws and policies are putting those factors in place. Are we doing
well,
damage in black communities or in black populations that is putting them in a situation that results in a development of um, personality traits or approaches to interactions with other people and approaches to life that result in committing crimes, right? Are we putting people in that situation? And if we are, what can we do to remedy that? And people don't want to look at it. Feminists in particular don't want to look at that, because part of the answer is, yeah, actually, we are encouraging women to make stupid sexual choices. That being not doing anything to disrupt the process of conception, and not choosing wisely in terms of a male partner and stuff like that. We are incentivizing single motherhood, and we are removing, therefore, the fathers from the homes in the black community before we do any other community, and creating a cycle of poverty, welfare reliance, and predisposition toward legal trouble and stuff. And so we need to fix that.
yeah. And another funny thing is that well, it's not really funny. Well, I mean, it is sort of funny, but outside of the usual feminists that will always screech at me, typically the white feminists, there's
Mm-hmm.
also oddly enough have gotten lots of hate from black feminists because
Yeah.
I do things like I point out the sky is blue and the single motherhood rate in the black community, you know,
Right.
and they'll say, well, the reason why that is because all black men are deadbeats,
But the
and they don't
truth
know how
is,
to.
those so-called deadbeats were raised by white single, or not white single mothers, black single mothers.
Yeah, and
So
here's what I
how did they become deadbeats?
yeah. Well, they learned from the one mother, that one parent they had.
Yeah, who taught them to do that? Right.
Yeah, and here's what I've always said is also, if I always said, if you want to really piss them off, what I love doing is what I'll tell them. What's the difference between a black feminist and a black slave? Well, at least black slaves knew they were owned by the Democrats.
That's true. But yeah, I when I look at stuff like that and I look at, all right, so our society is doing damage to this community and this factor is arising out of that damage. What can we undo? What can we change? What can we fix? And there's a lot of things that the left doesn't like to look at in terms of that. Another thing we can fix, school choice, right? It's a sad fact. Huh?
But don't you know that school choice is apparently racist?
Oh, I get told that all the time, but the sad fact is, there's a very small percentage, right, of schools in the United States that make up the network referred to as the school to prison pipeline. And they're generally in lower income neighborhoods. They're in neighborhoods where most of the students are raised in single mother households. Um,
In a scary
they're
truth.
they're in they're in neighborhoods that are run by Democrats, and they were the first schools to have discipline taken out of the school, so the students could not be treated, and to have zero tolerance policies put in its place, so the students could not be treated as little human beings who were learning ethics and morality and needed help informing those concepts instead of being yanked out of class and put into a juvenile detention facility for chewing gum. So those schools are traps that break kids, right? And there's a
Yeah,
division between two groups of people, parents in those schools. There are parents who do care about their kids but cannot afford to send them anywhere else. And then there are also parents whose kids run wild, who they're not just free range parenting, they are not parenting their kids. My friend who is a teacher in one of those schools here in the Dayton area said she can identify those kids by what they do when she hands out treats in class. All the
and
kids except for those kids eat their treats in the classroom. Those kids hoard their treats for later because that's the only thing they're going to get to eat that day.
I also made an interesting observation that also pissed off liberal black feminists.
Well, the thing I wanted to point out about those schools is this, all right?
Uh,
If you're black, you have a far higher percentage of your kids going to one of those schools.
yep.
And even if your kid is not in the group of, parents don't care kids, their education is disrupted and limited by the impact of the parents don't care kids on that school system. And it is unfair to an 8-year-old to be told that because the kid whose parents don't care is disadvantaged, you have to give up your opportunity for an education to accommodate them. The parents of that child, that 8-year-old, have the right to say, you know what, I want to send my kid across town to a different school so that they have a better opportunity for education. And then the community at large also has the right and the responsibility, when all the kids whose parents care yank their kids from that school, and the only kids that are left are the ones who are coming from households where nobody cares and the school is being used as a babysitter, to step in, evaluate the situation, and see if maybe they can benefit those kids by removing them from households where they are neglected
Mhm,
and providing them with caregivers who will actually do something for them in their lives.
mhm,
And that's like a little handful, but that would take two sets of kids who are being very negatively impacted by failing school systems that are managing a very bad situation right now, and provide them with pathways for improvement and to avoid growing up to become parts of those statistics that, say, white supremacists like to cite and point the finger at and say, look, this is evidence that black people are inferior, when in fact it's actually evidence that our society is failing black people.
mhm. Yep. And you know, it's just also another thing is like I've always pointed out sort of how there is different standards, and it does go back to black liberal feminists. I was going to say is like, in the media, I've said this: if Obama would have ran as a Republican and won, no one would have viewed him as the first black president. They would have focused entirely on the fact that his mother was white,
Yep.
and they would just say he's the first mixed race president.
If Obama had run as a Republican, do you know why he would not have won?
Why?
The left would have attacked him as an exploited tool of the white supremacist Republican Party.
Yep. But I mean, even if he did win, he would he would not be have called the first black president. He would have been called, the first white. If he would have been called the first mixed race president.
Yeah, he would have. They would have admitted that he was mixed race. That's
And
true.
and they'll say I've joked with this with black liberal feminists because they always, funny enough, I seem to attract them, and I don't try to, I just do.
Well, it could be worse. I seem to attract pedophiles.
Oh well, I mean, you could work for the police then.
Yeah, I actually have. I've had 2 conversations where I have forwarded things that women said to me to the FBI. One of them admitted to me that she had a relationship with a 14-year-old that she felt was perfectly fine because boys sexually mature before girls do, which isn't true. Both
Mhm.
sexes phase. And at 14, in our society, which, in which we are more sheltered because we don't die at 35 years old of uh, hardship of life, um, a 14-year-old is just not psychologically developed enough to consent to sex with an adult. Really, not to consent to sex with another 14-year-old either.
Yeah.
So that one I turned over to the FBI. Um,
Although, at
and
the very least, if a 14-year-old has sex with another 14-year-old, you can just say that, well, it was a bad event, but they
it's an
both.
incident. Yeah, it's an incident where the adults should step in and separate them and chaperone them to make sure it doesn't happen again and monitor them to make sure that they haven't had any negative events from the experience, and stuff like that. Nobody like 2 14-year-olds, nobody should be in trouble. It's just, this is obviously there's a need for guidance here, and somebody let these 2 14-year-olds hang out alone together for too many minutes before
Yeah.
checking
So
on them.
yeah. So I mean, the difference is like, well, obviously when it's an adult and a teenager like that, there's an exploitative factor. Whereas
Right,
if it's 2 14-year-olds, you can just say it's an issue of guidance, like watching over them, and it's a stupid thing that it's probably something that they stupidly did, not thinking about the consequences.
right, and not understanding the consequences either. But that situation, like, yeah, I would not punish 2 14-year-olds in that situation. I would mentor them to get them to understand that they really need to not do that again, and then wait until they're older. And again, I would make sure that they were kept in a more chaperoned situation so that they didn't have the opportunity to make that mistake.
All right.
But yeah, in any case, I've had women argue with me that boys can consent when girls can't. The
Mhm.
other one um, said something about having sexted with she's like, well, the boy who sexted with me not originated but initiated the contact, so he consented, so it's not child porn. And I was like, actually, yes it is. Even if he took the pictures, you, being the adult in the situation, should have known better. And this is not something that you should get away with.
You should have
At which
wasn't appropriate.
Right. And at which point, that was the other one. I like, in both cases, I don't know if these women were blustering or not, but it doesn't matter. They admitted to crimes that are exploitative. That like, if a boy started trying to flirt with me, my first thing would be like, do you understand what a shit deal you're asking for here?
Well,
Like,
yeah, at your age.
because yeah, even when I was 30 or 25 or something like that, an underage boy. Well, I guess I wasn't married at 25, but still, by the as soon as I was married, that would have been my first response.
Mhm.
Um, would have been like, you're asking to play second fiddle to another man. Why would you do that? But especially a young guy who should be having his first experiences of dating and innocence and going to movies and hanging out at restaurants and wondering what she's going to look like on the next date and what interesting things she's going to say and trying to figure out what interesting things he's going to say. Like, you don't need to be getting involved with somebody significantly older than you, and especially not playing second fiddle to somebody who's in a relationship with somebody else. But like that would be my first thing. And then if I was in a situation like that with I've never been hit on by a kid. So there was that's kind of a fortunate thing for me. But if that ever happened to me, like the instinct I'd have would be protective. Like what's going on that this kid is making himself vulnerable like that to an adult who could be anything. And you know, I I would find a way to protect the kid from not just their own bad instincts, but any adult. If they're going to do that with one adult, they might do that with other adults, and eventually they will run into somebody who won't act like the adult in the room and who would exploit them.
Yeah,
And so I would be worried for the kid. But there are people that act like and again I use the ice cream analogy. There are people that talk about sexual relations as though if a kid said they want to eat 10 gallons of ice cream, you're just obligated to accommodate that wish, and they have the capacity to make that decision, and you're not doing anything wrong if you feed them 10 gallons of ice cream, when in reality you fucking are doing something horribly wrong. And it doesn't matter if the kid thinks they want 10 gallons of ice cream. You're an adult. 10 gallons of ice cream is going to make them sick. You know that there are all kinds of other problems with that. And that you shouldn't feed a kid 10 gallons of ice cream. And you're an adult. You know that a 14-year-old isn't prepared to handle the brain changes, the chemical changes that are going to take place in his or her brain after the formation of an intimate partnership and the ultimate breakup that happens later, that you could cause somebody to commit suicide. You could create a pregnancy in a body that's not ready to handle it, and with a brain that's not ready to handle it. You could put that person in a position of having of bearing a child and having to give that child up for adoption, all kinds of things, and that's not to mention the fact that the person may simply later regret losing their virginity at 14 years old. And
yeah,
it's just heartbreaking that there are that many people that would argue this person can consent to sex when this person isn't competent to make those kinds of decisions for themselves yet. Even though they will be a few years later, that doesn't mean they are now. But
yeah.
the worst I've run into are pedophiles that argue that a 5-year-old can consent to sex.
Damn.
A 5-year-old still believes in the fucking tooth fairy.
Yeah.
You know, you're going to tell me that somebody who is gullible enough because their brain hasn't developed past that level of gullibility yet to actually believe that there is a fairy that flies around at night and takes your teeth out from under your pillow and leaves you $1
Well, to be fair, there.
is, you know,
Well, to be fair, there are some modern women that actually believe Prince Charming is an actual person.
that's true. But what I'm saying is, you can tell me that a person who is so gullible that you can tell them a story about something so ridiculous and they will believe it and have the expectation, they'll stick their teeth under the pillow with the expectation that a fairy is going to come in to their house in the middle of the night, take the tooth, and leave $1 under their pillow. But they are competent to consent to sex.
Yeah, and another thing is like people don't. Another common argument is against the porn are the problem with porn is always focused on women, and basically it's like, oh, look at all these women, they're being sexually objectified. And I said, men are being objectified too, because
Well,
just a different way. Because here's the thing: men are being objectified because what they're doing is it's not just like the argument is made that, well, it's objectifying women because it's seeing them as just sex objects. But I've also said that's also the other way around in a way, because it also teaches women to see men as success objects.
I
You
think
give
another
them,
argument in terms of porn that I think is a lot of people neglect is this: viewing women as objects of desirability based on the feminist claim that women are viewed as sex objects stems from a desire to please the woman, right? You look at the types of porn that are popular, like that are not rare, odd kinks involving abuse and stuff like that, which are actually an abnormal thing, not necessarily in
well,
and of themselves bad, but normal, like the vanilla porn, even not so vanilla porn. The underlying theme is the female orgasm, right? That is an important selling point of it, and the focus of porn that is designed for men is on viewing the woman's pleasured response to being stimulated, right? Hating to like break down porn like that, but that's not treating someone as an object in terms of like a non-human thing. It's not dehumanizing to fetishize someone's pleasure,
yeah. Well, I
right?
mean,
It is in fact humanizing. If porn objectified women, the entire focus would be on the man's orgasm.
hey, well, I mean, have you ever noticed that feminists will never talk about the pay gap in pornography?
Yeah, I've noticed. But it's in all honesty, that just goes further into the humanization of women. Who's
Yeah.
more important, the female star or the male star? And if it's that the
Or,
female star is more important, then again, we're not looking at a system that treats women as objects, but
yeah.
as a system that places the value of women above that of men.
Yeah, I'm just saying, it's sort of using their logic against them.
Yep, but the problem with using their logic against them, like
But
it's
they're
good. It's good in terms of people viewing the conversation. And it's good when you get somebody who is using feminist logic but is not a feminist, when you can break it down and show, hey, I wouldn't throw in my lot with these people. They are stupid. But when you're dealing with an actual feminist, they don't care. If they're hypocrites, they don't care if you expose their hypocrisy. They will continue to be hypocrites out loud in public with enthusiasm, forever.
well, you have to remember feminist logic is an oxymoron.
Yeah.
You can be logical, or you can be a feminist, or you can be neither, but you can't be both a feminist and logical at the same time.
Yeah, that is true. Shit.
All right,
I'm
well,
starting to growl at you more and more. I'm really sorry about that, but
oh, it's fine. Well, I mean,
I'm recovering from pneumonia.
uh,
I didn't know. I shouldn't say I didn't know. I didn't accept. I didn't admit because I knew it. These symptoms are referred to as pneumonia when you have liquid in your lungs.
yeah.
But I didn't think of it that way, and I ignored it. But another person who caught the same cold I caught from the same person I caught it from has just been diagnosed with pneumonia and has the same symptoms I had. So I'm like, yeah.
But Hannah, you know that you just fell with ammonia. You didn't do anything that might have. risk, giving you an increased risk of getting it?
No, I worked 80 hours with pneumonia. But yeah, I'm starting to flag a
Uh,
little bit in being able to talk.
well,
So
you've been talking a while.
what time?
Uh,
Holy shit, it's 2:22. What did we started at 11, right?
yeah.
My gosh.
Okay. Well, and I'm gonna go eat and
Sorry.
sleep.
Well, you're an easy person to talk to. Like, do you still have both ears?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean,
Okay, well, at least I didn't talk them off then.
well, yeah, I'm a blabbermouth myself,
That
so
is true.
you get two blabbermouths in the same conversation. You end up waking up. You end up having a literal 24-hour conversation and not knowing it.
Yeah. We could do that. We could do that, but it probably wouldn't be a good idea.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
it was very nice to get to have this conversation. So thanks for having me on.
all right. Well, and it was nice having you on. Well, and I hope and I'll be glad to hear more of what you say on Twitter. And can you tell the audience where they can find you?
Certainly. You can find me on YouTube under Badger live streams. You try looking up Honey Badger live streams if you end up getting sports casting instead of our political stuff, because there's two channels called Badger live streams. We're the political one, and there's a sports team called the Honey Badgers. And then you can also find me at Honey Badger Radio. If you can't find the Badger live streams channel, and you click on one of the HBR Talk openers, and click on watch the stream, it'll take you to one of the live streams on the channel, so you can find the HBR, the Honey Badger live streams channel that way too. You can
All right.
find me on Twitter as Onero's Grip, and it's ONEIOROSGRIP. And those are the things that I do the most.
Yeah. And can you tell the audience about any future plans you have?
Um, well, I'm still doing a bunch of discussions on HBR Talk. I have some ideas, but nothing that I have made a solid plan of step by step. Here's how I'm going to do it. But I think there are some things that need to be addressed, and one of them is making an argumentative description of the ways in which communism and socialism, which are basically the same thing,
Yeah.
and pretty much most other forms of collectivism, and in particular the authoritarian types of collectivism, are all just feudalism by other names.
Yeah.
Because it's something that's important for people to understand in terms of what are
It's all,
you actually accepting when you accept these things.
it's all collectivism.
And I mean, if you look at feudalism, part of the reason that it died out was because it kept the divisions between classes more like walls, pretty stark. If you were born poor, you were going to be poor all your life, and your kids were going to be poor. And if you were born rich, like you could go down if something went wrong, but you couldn't go back up. But you could basically maintain your status all your life and pass it on to your kids. And, in a free society, you could have people born in any part of the class spectrum transfer to other classes, other parts of the class spectrum, and then recover if their transfer was a loss. Their kids are not doomed to necessarily stay in that area, and so on. So it's an important thing to make people understand that if they want people to have the ability to improve their lot in life, if they start out with unlucky circumstances, it is better if we do not have an authoritarian collectivist society, because those feudal systems just create stark class divisions that can't be crossed as easily.
All right. Well,
So
like I said, it was nice listening to you. Maybe we can have another conversation sometime.
definitely.
All right. Well, that is all for today. This has been the Brass Exchange with Mr. Brass and Hannah Wallen. Thank you all, and good night.